Last week, a friend of mine told me that he had a Parshas Ketores written on a Klaf and was covered with a plastic sheet, and the plastic was wearing out, so he wanted to throw the plastic out. So he asked me if it's Tashmisha Kedusha, it needs to be put in Geniza, or just Tashmisha Mitzvah and could be Nizrak. I said, I thought it's Tashmisha Kedusha, the Chodesh should be put in Geniza. He said, would you mind asking Rav Shechter? So I asked Rav Shechter on Friday, and as often is the case, the answer to the Shaila itself is not the surprising part, it's what he then says afterwards. That's the surprising. So Rav Shechter said, yes, Tashmisha Kedusha. I don't see why, of course, Tashmisha Kedusha should put in Geniza, but I don't know why anyone is allowed to have a Parshas Ketores in the first place. Ooh, okay, so now we have what to talk about. So let's discuss what exactly is the problem with having the Parshas Ketores. So we have to discuss, we'll back up a little bit and discuss the reason that people say the Parshas Ketores, which hopefully we all do, at least sometimes, the reason that it's written, the Parshas Ketores is written, and why it might be a halachic problem to have a Parshas Ketores written on a Klaf. So first, the value of reciting Pitum HaKetores every day. We should distinguish over here. There's the Parshas Ketores, the Pesukim in the Torah, and then there's the Brais of Pitum HaKetores, which describes how the Ketores was done, so how the Ketores was made. So there is an Indian, of course, from the Shalma Parmas Vaseinu. The Gemara tells us that Avram Avinu asked, as the Chumash says, Avram Avinu asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'meh Eda Ki Irashena, how do I know that my children are going to inherit Eretz Yisrael? And the Gemara interprets that to mean Be'ez Zuchus. What Zuchus will my children have? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Zuchus HaKarbanos. So Avram Avinu says, that's wonderful. B'zman Shein Beis Hamikdash Kayim, B'zman Shein Beis Hamikdash Kayim. Then what's going to be? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Shalma Parmas Vaseinu. Then you learn about Karbanos, you talk about Karbanos, and through that it's as if you are makriv Karbanos. So l'chora, by reciting the Pesukim of the Ketores and the Brais of Pitum HaKetores, in a certain sense, we are fulfilling the hakrava of the Ketores, and that, as we pointed out in the past, Talmid Rabbeinu Yonah in the Sechus Brachos says that it might be a kiyum to oraisa to say those parshios that are related to Karbanos. Talmid Rabbeinu Yonah talks about the idea that normally dvarim she b'chsav yatara she lomrim bal peh, you're not allowed to say dvarim she b'chsav bal peh, but he says if you're being mekayim another mitzvah by saying those psukim, then you're allowed to say the bal peh. L'mashal Kriya Shema, you're allowed to say Kriya Shema bal peh, even though it's Torah Shebechsav, because you're being Mekayim another mitzvah other than just the Talmud Torah. So you have, or Birchas Kohanim, you're allowed to, the Kohanim don't have to read the brachos from a Chumash, they can say it Baal Peh because they're being Mekayim another mitzvah. Ben Yoda says, or Karbanos, because since you're being Mekayim in Shalom Parnas Vaseinu, you're being Mekayim the Karbanos, sounds like Midoraisa, you're being Mekayim the mitzvah of Karbanos, so that's why you're allowed to say it Baal Peh. So the point is, though, that on the very basic level, that's the great value of reciting the Parshas HaKetores as well as the Pitum HaKetores. But in addition to that value, there are lots of skulas involved with saying the Ketores. What do I mean by lots of skulas? Well, first of all, in the Torah itself, in Parshas Korach, apparently Ketores had the ability to stop a plague. So that's pretty impactful. Second of all, if you look through a lot of the Sifrei Achronim and the Mekubalim, you'll find a tremendous amount. So Chaim Pelagi writes that it solves problems of that non-Jewish governments cause the Jewish people. The Medrash Hanelam in Parshas Vayera, that it nullifies terrible Gzeros Roos against us. The Zohar says that if a person says Ketores with Kavanah every day, he's going to get a chelik in Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, and he's not going to suffer in this world, and he's not going to suffer in Gehenim, and the Sitra Achra will have no shlita over him. The Chidar writes that just saying the words brings great nachas ruach to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but the Kavanah you just have to make sure it's purely Shem Shemayim, and the schar that comes is going to come in Mela, but it's going to be fantastic. The Zohar in Parshas Pinchas and the Yisod V'Shorish HaAvodah say that it's Nitzel Mimisa, it's Matzil Mimisa, saves a person from death. In Mavri Yavok, he says that especially in a base Avel, it elevates the neshama and it protects the Avelim. So lots and lots of skulas relating to the saying of the Ketores. I heard from Rabbi Mati Neuberger that he said that Rebbitzin Feiner, Rabbi Feiner's wife, told him that when she was growing up in her family, her mother used to tell her that you say Ketores every day with Kavana and you'll be zoche to a good shidduch. That's what she and her sisters were always told, right? So you know what kind of shidduchim they were zoche to, right? So there's Rabbi Feiner, our very own Rabbi Shmuel Marcus, Tzaddik Elyon we're talking about over here. I mean, we're talking talking about some pretty special people. And you don't even know Ari Pearl, the third brother, also a Talmud, a tremendous special person. So I don't know if it's because of the Ketores partially or because of other things also, Mustama, that they were zocha to these kinds of shidduchim. I don't know if there are more sisters. I'm not leaving anyone out on purpose. I don't know the family. I only know these three. But the primary segula, though, if I were to ask you, what's the segula associated with Ketores? Why do people really say it? What's the segula? Parnasa. It all comes down to money. So the Rama in Yardeh Simrei Samachesef Yiralef writes, in the name of the Maril, that a person should not serve as a sandik twice on two different children, right, in the same family. Why? Where does that come from? So it's based on a comment the Gemara in Yuma has about the Ketores. Yuma Daf Chavav. The Gemara says that the same Kohen would not do the Ketores twice because the performance of the Ketores serves as a segula for wealth. So we want to spread the wealth. Let more Kohanim have the wealth. So the Maril says, and that therefore extends to being a sandik, because being a sandik is like being maktir the Ketores. But it's all based on Ketores. In fact, the Nod Yud and Madur Kama Simin Yud says that's why we always say in Kelukenu before the Pitum Ketores. Why? Because people tend to start, when people get wealthy, it's natural to start to feel they start thinking that it's all about themselves. So Zaktan Yehuda, that's why we say right before now in Kelukenu, that it all is it's about a Kodesh Baruch Hu. It's not because of our own selves. And in fact, that's what Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yakar has a little bit of a different explanation. Who's Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yakar? A Rebbe of the Ramban in his Perush Hatfilos VaBrachos says that we say in Kelukenu right before Pitum Ketores so that we do not mistakenly think that the power of Ketores is what makes us rich. It's the power of Hashem that makes us rich. But you do see that there is this inyan of segula. Okay, when is one supposed to recite Ketores? By when I mean three different things. Which tefillah of the day should it be associated with? Should it be before or after that tefillah? And is it every day? So one at a time. Which tefillah of the day? The Torah in Sim Kuf Lamed Gimel says definitely after Shachris. By Shachris you say Pitum Ketores, and the Ramah quotes that as well. The Torah then says V'chein be'erev la'achar she'yigmru tefillas arvis nogin lomer Pitum Ketores. After Mariv you say Pitum Ketores. The Ramah quotes that as well. Magen Avram in Sim Reish Lamed Gimel says that at Mincha Tov lomer gam kein Pitum Ketores. So by all three tefillas of the day there is some makor to tell you that you say Pitum Ketores. Okay. Before davening or after davening? So the Rabbeinu B'chai in Parsha Shmini, Parak Tes, Pasuk Gimel, says that immediately after Moshe Rabbeinu taught Aaron how to do the Ketores, the Pasuk reports that Vayava Moshe Aaron El Ol Moed, Vayetzu, meaning in the Ol Moed they were teaching, Moshe was teaching Aaron about the Ketores, then Vayetzu, they went out, and they blessed the nation right afterwards. Why did they bless the nation right afterwards? Because riding the coattails of the Zechus of the Ketores, the Tfilos and the Brachos that a person says are more impactful, which makes it sound like the tefillah should come right after the Ketores. So when should you say the Ketores? Like during Karbanos, we should say the Pitum Ketores. That's what it sounds like before the actual tefillah. What's the logic to do the Pitum Ketores afterwards? So Tzror Mar asks the Kasha, he says, why is it that the Mizbeach Hazav, the Mizbeach HaKetores, is listed in Parshas Tetzaveh? It's very much out of order. Parshas Truma is all the Kalim of the Mishkan, Tetzaveh, the Big Dekuna, and then at the very end, after all that, we have the Mizbeach Hazav. Well, why is it so out of place? And he suggests that the Ketores is a Mikasher. It brings together all of the disparate parts of the Mishkan, all of the different avodos. That's the role of Ketores. That's why it has all these different samanim, including ones that smell bad, that are keneged the Rishayim. It's Mekasher of Klal Yisrael. It connects all the avodah, connects the entire Mishkan. That's why it's in the middle of the Mishkan, and that's why that's the Mizbeach Ketores is right in the middle of the Mishkan. The Ketores includes things that represent all kinds of Jews. It's this great connector, this great Mekasher. So once you have all of the tefillah done, then you do the Ketores, and that sort of brings it all together. In fact, Rabbi Yaakov Emden struggled with this. When should he say it? So he said he split. He would say Parshas HaKetores before davening, and Pitum Ketores after davening, to grab onto the Zechus of the Ketores at both ends, with both of these possibilities. Okay, how many days a week should one be reciting Parshas HaKetores and Pitum Ketores? Every day? Just Shabbos? When do we do it? So this involves a much bigger discussion. The Beis Yosef in Sim Kuf Lamed Gimel quotes from the Mari Abuhab not to say Pitum Ketores by heart, because if you say it by heart, Shema Yechsar Echad Me'asamanim Ve'echayiv Misa. B'kriya kimo b'haktara. Just like if you're maktir the Ketores and you forget one ingredient. You're chayiv misa. If you say the Ketores and forget one ingredient, you're also going to be chayiv misa. So don't say it by heart. Read it from somewhere so that you make sure you don't skip any part of the Ketores. The Ramah quotes this and says, and therefore many people are knowing totally say it on Shabbos. Because during the week we're in such a rush, we're not going to be careful enough. Even if we are reading it, we may read it, daven it up so fast that we're gonna skip one of the samanim and be chayv misa. The risk is not worth the reward. Wait until Shabbos when you have plenty of time and it's relaxed, and you'll be able to say the Pitum HaKetoros properly. They say that the Arizal used to count them out as he was mentioning them on his fingers. Now, big kasha is that there are 11 samanim, and the Arizal I think only had 10 fingers like the rest of us. But I guess he knew that it's the 10, and then there's one more right afterwards. So that's, but to make sure, to be very careful, there's people are knowing to be very careful not to miss any of the samanim. Beis Yosef, though, rejects this whole concern of the Maria Buav. So, what, you're going to be chayv misa? He says, look, im halacha nekabel, avlim ledin yesh tshuva. If you're going to tell me that you have some sort of Masorah and there's something that's beyond my understanding as to what, I'll have to be makabel. But if this is based on logic, the logic is not that way. It's not logical to say that you can be chayv misa for missing one of the samanim. Why is it that you chayv misa if you miss out one of the samanim in the Beis Hamikdash when you bring the Ketores? He says that's pashut. Kohen Gadol's chayv misa if he misses out one of the samanim because it's a bia rekanis. He's going into the Kodesh HaKodashim, on Yom Kippurim. If he doesn't have proper Ketores, so it's a bia rekanis. He's going in for no reason. For a bia rekanis, he's going to be chayv misa. We're not going anywhere. We're standing there in shul. We're standing in Queens or Woodmere or whatever. Right? We're not going anywhere. What are we doing? What kind of bia rekanis? You're not going to be chayv misa, says Beis Yosef. Furthermore, says Beis Yosef, even if the Chiyuv Misa is not on account of Bia Rekanis, but on account of being Maktir Ketores Zara, that you're bringing a Ketores that's not the right Ketores, still, that's only a problem when you're actually Maktir something. He says, we don't take a Neshama Parmas Vaseinu to be that, that literal, that we're actually being Maktir, so it's not going to be in violation of the Haktara. The Magen Avram adds that Eina Misa Ela B'mezid. You're also only Chayv Misa if you do something B'mezid. If you accidentally skip one, that's not called, you're not going to be Chayv Misa for such a thing. And for those reasons, the Magen Avram also disagrees with the Ramah and says, don't say it just on Shabbos. You want to tell me, Ramah, to say it just on Shabbos because you're afraid you might miss one and then it's going to be Chayv Misa. Says Magen Avram, I got 3 good reasons why you're not Chayv Misa, and therefore, L'chumra, say it every day. Right? People think of the Magen Avram as like, L'kula, don't worry, you're not going to be Chayv Misa. No, it's a Chumra, and therefore, you got to say it every single day. So where does it come from to read from a Klaf? So Ravad Yosef quotes that the Kaf HaChaim in Simin Tov, Sif Katan Chai, that's where he quotes it. It's Simin Yud Zayin, right? Gematria of Tov, and Sif Katan Yud Ches, Chai. So in Simin Tov, Sif Katan Chai, now you're never going to forget it, right? Where to find it. So the Kaf HaChaim writes in Simin Tov, Sif Katan Chai, that you should dafka read it from a Klaf, written in Ksav Ashuris, in a Ksiva HaKosher L'Sefer Torah. It should be written like by a scribe on a Klaf with a proper Ksiva, and that's a guarantee for wealth. Then you know for sure you're going to have Ashirus, you're going to have more Parnasa than you need. It's going to be wonderful. So the problem with that is, sounds like a great idea, but the Gemara in Maseches Gittin, Daf Samach Amud Aleph, asks whether you're allowed to write a Megillah Latino L'Islamid Ba. What does Megillah mean? It doesn't mean Megillah Sastra. It means, can you write a section of Torah separate from the rest of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah? Why? Because the kid in yeshiva is learning Parshas Lech Lecha. So you want to just write Parshas Lech Lecha. You shouldn't have to schlep around a big Chamisha Chumshei Torah or a big Torah scroll wherever he goes, and it doesn't fit in his backpack. Let him have just a Parshas Lech Lecha, right? So that's the kasha, that's the shayla the Gemara asks. So the Gemara concludes, Ein Kosvin. Can't do it. You're not allowed to. Rashi explains that even if you hold that the Torah was not Chasuma Nitna, that the Torah was Megillah Nitna, that the Torah was given that way, it was given in pieces, yeah, but once it all came together, now it's all together, and you're not allowed to break up a single parsha. Shulchan Aruch in Yardes and Reish Pei Gimel Sif Beis, Paskins la halacha lo yichtov megillah b'fnei atzma shiu ba parshios vein koson megillah tinok l'slamid ba. You're not allowed to write separate parshios of the chumash without the rest of the chumash, and even for a tinok to learn from, you're not allowed to do it. So that sounds pretty bad. Then you're not allowed to write parshios of the Torah on a klaf. So there is a heter of Eis Lasos. The Shach over there on the side of the Shulchan Aruch quotes from many Rishonim, the Rif, the Mordechai, the Aguda, and other poskim that it's he doesn't say the other poskim, he just says in Shar poskim that it's mutter l'tinok l'islamid bo because Eis Lasos Hashem eferes orzecha. Otherwise, the child's not going to learn. No one's ever going to get an education if the kid has to bring a Sefer Torah to yeshiva every day. It's not going to happen. No one has a Sefer Torah in their house to send the kid to yeshiva, so it can't be. So because of Eis Lasos Hashem eferes orzecha, we allow writing down, and that's why we're allowed to write down the parshas of Kriya Shema and the parshas that are part of Tefillah, because otherwise there would be a great bittul of Kriya Shema and of Tefillah. So the Taz, however, points out that Eis Lasos only works for things that are absolutely necessary, like educating children. That's absolutely necessary. Lislamed bo. But he says, for example, those who write psukim ala kosa le'eza simin tov, they write psukim on the wall for some sort of positive simin. Lav shapir avdi, the Torah chasumanitna. They're not doing right, because the Torah is supposed to be in a single unit. It should not be broken up and written just parts of it. In fact, the Tashbetz, it's quoted in the Piskei Teshuvah Yardeis and Reish Pei Gimel, says that even when you're doing it for Eis Lasos, even when you have the heter of Eis Lasos, Tashbetz writes, Piskei Teshuvah quotes from Tashbetz Chelik Aleph Siman Beis, that even when it is Eis Lasos, it cannot be done b'ksav ashuras al klaf. Even when it says lasos, just write it in a regular notebook or something. Have a little chumash or something. But to do with klaf, with a ksav ashuras, with everything, says the Tashbetz, that you're not allowed to do, even if you have an Eis Lasos. So even if you wanted to argue that your segula for ashiras is so important that you need to have Ketores written separately, so good. So read it from the siddur. You don't have to read it from a klaf. So this is a major issue. This is a major question. Meaning, where does this come from? So we see the Kaf HaChaim says it's a big skula, and the skula only works if you do. But what about the halacha? What do you do when the skula is against the halacha? So Rav Yosef has a tshuva about this. And Rav Yosef in Yabia Omer Chelik Tes Yardei Sim L'Chav Gimel writes L'Chachila Ein Roi Lichtov Pitum Ketores B'fnei Atzma. Shouldn't do it. Shouldn't write Pitum Ketores on a separate parchment. But b'diavad mutar likrota. But if you have it already, so then you can read from it, and then you'll tap into that skula. But you shouldn't do. I don't think that means you can buy one, because if you buy one, you're encouraging them to write another one. And we don't want to encourage that. You're not supposed to do that. Sofrim shouldn't be writing them. Maybe if you have one around the house, someone already bought you one or whatever, so then you can use it, says Rav Yosef. So that was Rav Shachtus Ha'ara. Rav Shachtus said, as soon as I asked him, he said, I don't understand why people feel the need to write the Ketores on a klaf. They should read it from the siddur. Meaning, of course, you should say it. That we saw it clearly. But who says that you have to say it dafka from a klaf? You should read it from a siddur. But nevertheless, the fact that the Kaf HaChaim mentions this and that there are early sources for such a school of reading it from a klaf leads you to believe that not everyone agreed with Rav Vadia's conclusion. It's just unclear to me why. I'm sure I'll get some emails with some explanations as to why it is that it would be okay and not a violation of that explicit halacha in Shulchan Aruch.